The autumn wind carried the scent of dust and desperation through the streets of Millfield, Colorado, where dreams went to die and hope traded for copper pennies. The year was 1887, and the silver mines that once promised fortune had yielded. Nothing but empty shafts and broken promises. Main Street stretched like a scar through the heart of town, lined with boarded windows and businesses that folded faster than Sunday prayer books. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Whitmore adjusted the leather satchel slung across his shoulder, feeling the weight of 23 school books and a lifetime of purpose pressing against his ribs. His boots, worn thin from years of walking between one-room schoolhouses across the frontier, crunched against the hard-pan earth as he surveyed what would be his newest classroom. The building before him sagged like an old man's shoulders, its roof patched with mismatched shingles and its door hanging slightly askew. He pushed inside, squinting as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior. Dust motes danced in the afternoon, light streaming through cracked windows. Wooden desks sat in crooked rows, some missing legs, others bearing the carved initials of students long since grown and gone. A blackboard dominated the front wall, its surface so scratched and faded the chalk barely showed against the worn slate. Thomas set down his satchel and rolled up his sleeves. At 28, he had already taught in 7 different towns across Colorado and Wyoming, following the mining booms and cattle drives, bringing literacy to places where books were scarcer than clean water. His hands, calloused from years of ranch work before he discovered his calling as an educator, began arranging the desks into neat rows. The door creaked behind him. Thomas turned to find a man in a wrinkled suit, hat in hand, nervously shifting, his weight from foot to foot. The stranger's face bore the telltale signs of a man who had made too many bad decisions, deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth sagging with the weight of unpaid debts. "You the new schoolmaster?" the man asked, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of someone who spent too much time in saloons. "Thomas Whitmore," he replied, extending a hand. "And you are?" "Marcus Hartwell. I hear you're looking for students." Marcus avoided Thomas's eyes, instead focusing on a point somewhere near the teacher's left shoulder. "Got a daughter, real bright girl, read better than most grown folks." Thomas studied the man carefully. In his years of teaching frontier children, he had learned to read the signs of family trouble the way a rancher read storm clouds on the horizon. Marcus Hartwell reeked of desperation and cheap whiskey, his clothes expensive once, but now threadbare and stained. "How old is your daughter, Mr. Hartwell?" 17, name's Catherine Hartwell." Marcus fumbled with his hat brim, twisting it between nervous fingers. "She's got a real hunger for learning, you understand. Always got her nose in a book when she can find one. I write poetry too, though I can't make heads or tails of it myself. I'd be pleased to meet her. When can she start?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Well, that's the thing, Mr. Whitmore. Times have been difficult. The mine dried up, and I owe considerable money to some folks who ain't the patient sort. Catherine, she's been helping to keep the house, but—" Thomas waited, recognizing the pause of a man struggling with words he didn't want to speak. "But what, Mr. Hartwell?" Nothing at all. I'll bring her by tomorrow morning." Marcus jammed his hat back onto his head and hurried toward the door. "She'll be really excited to meet you, Mr. Whitmore. Really excited indeed." The door slammed shut, leaving Thomas alone with the dust and silence. Something in Marcus Hartwell's manner troubled him, a furtiveness that spoke of secrets and shame. Thomas had seen enough desperate fathers to recognize the signs of a man backed into a corner, making choices no decent person should have to make. He spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning the schoolhouse, sweeping out years of accumulated grime and patching the worst holes in the walls with whatever materials he could scrounge. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas walked to the boarding house where he had rented a small room. Mrs. Eleanor Crawford, the boarding house proprietor, was a woman of 60 with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. She served him a simple supper of beef stew and cornbread while studying him with the intensity of a hawk watching a field mouse. "You met Marcus Hartwell today," she said. "It wasn't a question. He has a daughter who might attend my school." Mrs. Crawford snorted, a sound that conveyed volumes about her opinion of Marcus Hartwell. "That man's debts are deeper than the mines that failed him. Word is he owes Silas Blackwood nearly $3,000. Thomas looked up from his stew. "Silas Blackwood? Runs the Silver Dollar Saloon and Gaming House, also runs Girls Upstairs, if you catch my meaning. Blackwood's got his fingers in half the businesses in town, and he collects what's owed him one way or another." A cold knot formed in Thomas's stomach. "What does that have to do with Marcus Hartwell's daughter?" Mrs. Crawford's expression grew. "Grim. Pretty girl like Catherine Hartwell? Smart as a whip but raised poor? Men like Blackwood see opportunity where decent folks see tragedy." Thomas set down his spoon, appetite gone. "You think Hartwell would? I think a man drowning will grab onto anything to keep from going under, even if it drags someone else down with him." Mrs. Crawford began clearing dishes with sharp, angry movements. "That girl deserves better. Always did. Used to see her at the general store, reading whatever books she could get her hands on. Had dreams of becoming a teacher herself, last. I heard." That night Thomas lay awake staring at the ceiling, his mind churning with possibilities he didn't want to consider. He had come to Millfield to teach children, to plant seeds of knowledge in young minds that might bloom into something beautiful despite the harsh soil of frontier life. The thought that one of those potential students might be in danger made his chest tight with a familiar anger. He had felt this same rage once before, years ago, when he discovered the corrupt school board in Silver Creek selling teaching positions to the highest bidder regardless of qualification. Thomas had been young then, idealistic, believing that truth and justice would prevail if he simply spoke loudly enough. Instead, he had been run out of town by men who valued profit over children's futures, but he had learned since then, learned that sometimes a man had to do more than teach reading and arithmetic. Sometimes he had to fight for the right to teach, at all. The next morning arrived grey and cold, with clouds hanging low over the mountains like a promise of early snow. Thomas arrived at the schoolhouse before dawn, lighting the wood stove and preparing his lessons for whatever students might appear. He had enough supplies for perhaps 15 children, though he suspected he would be lucky to see half that number. By 8 o'clock, 3 children had arrived, 2 boys whose parents ran the general store, and a girl of perhaps 12 whose mother worked as a seamstress. They sat quietly, watching Thomas with the cautious curiosity of young animals, unsure whether this new adult represented threat or opportunity. "Good morning, children," Thomas began, his voice carrying the warmth that had made him beloved in every school he had taught. "My name is Mr. Whitmore, and I'm here to help you discover just how magnificent your minds truly are." The morning progressed well. The children were eager learners, hungry for knowledge after months without a proper teacher. Thomas found himself falling into the familiar rhythm of instruction, his earlier worries temporarily pushed aside by the joy of watching young faces light up with understanding. It was nearly noon when the door opened again. Marcus Hartwell entered. First, but it was the young woman behind him who captured Thomas's attention completely. Catherine Hartwell moved with the grace of someone accustomed to making herself small, her shoulders slightly hunched, as if she expected a blow to fall at any moment. Her brown hair was pinned back severely, revealing a face that would have been beautiful if not for the haunted shadows around her dark eyes. She wore a simple dress of faded blue calico, mended in several places, but clean and carefully pressed. In her arms, she clutched a worn leather satchel that Thomas recognized as the universal accessory of the dedicated student. "Mr. Whitmore," Marcus said, his voice too loud in the quiet schoolhouse. "This here's my Catherine. Catherine, meet your new teacher." Catherine raised her eyes briefly to meet Thomas's gaze, and in that instant he saw something that made his heart clench. Intelligence burned there, bright and fierce, but it was tempered by a bone-deep weariness that no 17-year-old should possess. This was a young woman who had learned to hide her light rather than let it shine, who had discovered that dreams could be dangerous things in a world that viewed girls as commodities rather than human beings. "Miss Hartwell," Thomas said gently, offering her the same respectful tone he would use with any adult. "Your father tells me you're quite the scholar." A faint blush coloured her cheeks. "I try to read when I can, sir, though books are scarce in Millfield." "What sort of books do you prefer?" Her eyes lit up briefly before she glanced nervously at her father. "Poetry mostly, Shakespeare when I can find it, and books about teaching methods. I've read Horace Mann's writings on common schools, and Catherine Beecher's work on female education." Thomas felt a surge of excitement. Here was a student who could not only learn, but inspire others to learn as well. "Those are excellent choices. Have you read John Dewey's recent essays on progressive education?" Thomas felt a surge of excitement. Here was a student who could not only learn, but inspire others to learn as well. "Those are excellent choices. Have you read John Dewey's recent essays on progressive education?" "I haven't been able to find any of his work, sir." "Are they difficult to obtain?" "I have several of his essays in my personal collection. You're welcome to borrow them." Catherine's face transformed with pure joy, years seeming to fall away as she smiled with genuine delight. For a moment, Thomas glimpsed the brilliant young woman she could become, given proper encouragement and opportunity. Marcus cleared his throat loudly, destroying the moment. "Well, that's really nice. But Catherine's got obligations at home. Can't spend all her time with books." "Of course," Thomas replied carefully, noting how Catherine's shoulders sagged at her father's words. "But education is never time wasted, Mr. Hartwell. Your daughter has remarkable potential." "Potentially don't pay debts," Marcus muttered, then seemed to realize what he had said. "I mean, practical skills are important too, you understand. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story." Thomas understood far more than Marcus realized. He spent the rest of the afternoon observing Catherine as she worked alongside the younger students, helping them with their lessons with infinite patience and skill. She was a natural teacher, able to explain complex concepts in simple terms that children could grasp easily. But Thomas also noticed other things. The way Catherine flinched when her father's voice grew sharp, how she seemed to shrink into herself whenever Marcus looked in her direction, the careful way she rationed her enthusiasm as if joy were a luxury she couldn't afford. When the school day ended, Marcus appeared promptly to collect his daughter. "Come along, Catherine. We've got business to attend to." Catherine gathered her things quickly, but not before Thomas saw her lingering glance at the books on his desk. "Thank you for today, Mr. Whitmore. It was wonderful." "You're welcome any time, Miss Hartwell. Remember, learning is a light that no one can extinguish once it's truly lit." She nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind his words, then followed her father out into the gathering dusk. Thomas stood at the window, watching them walk away, and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. In his years of teaching, he had learned to recognize the signs of a child in danger. Catherine Hartwell was brilliant, kind, and hungry for knowledge, but she was also trapped in a situation that threatened to destroy everything she could become. The question was, what was Thomas Whitmore prepared to do about it? As darkness fell, Over Millfield, Thomas began to formulate a plan. He had come to this town to teach, but sometimes teaching meant more than standing in front of a blackboard. Sometimes it meant standing between a student and the forces that would destroy her. Dreams, and if that required him to be more than just a schoolteacher, then so be it. Catherine Hartwell deserved a champion, and Thomas Whitmore had never walked away from a fight that mattered. 3 days passed before Thomas saw Catherine again. During those days, he threw himself into establishing his school, visiting families throughout Millfield to encourage enrollment. The response was mixed. Some parents eager for their children to receive proper education, others skeptical of book learning when survival demanded more practical skills. On Thursday evening, Thomas was reviewing lesson plans by lamplight when urgent knocking rattled his boarding house door. Mrs. Crawford answered, her voice sharp with concern. Heavy footsteps climbed the stairs, and moments later she appeared at Thomas's door with a young man he didn't recognize. "Mr. Whitmore," the stranger said, breathing hard as if he'd been running. "My name's Daniel Porter. I work at the Silver Dollar Saloon, and there's something you need to know about Catherine Hartwell." Thomas set down his pen, ice forming in his veins. "What about Miss Hartwell?" Daniel glanced nervously at Mrs. Crawford, who crossed her arms and planted herself firmly in the doorway. "Speak your piece, boy. Mr. Whitmore's got a right to know if one of his students is in trouble." "It's her father," Daniel began, ringing, his cap between his hands. "Marcus Hartwell came into the saloon tonight, drunk as a lord and desperate as a cornered rat. He was meeting with Silas Blackwood about his debts." "Go on," Thomas said quietly, though every instinct told him he didn't. "Want to hear what came next? Blackwood's been patient, but $3,000 is serious money. Hartwell's got nothing left to sell, no property, no livestock, nothing of value except—" Daniel's voice trailed off. "Except his daughter," Mrs. Crawford finished grimly. Daniel nodded miserably. "I heard the whole conversation from behind. The bar. Blackwood offered to wipe the debt clean in exchange for Catherine, said she'd work upstairs in his establishment, entertaining gentlemen callers. Hartwell tried to refuse at first, but Blackwood reminded him what happens to men who default on their debts in this town." Thomas stood slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "What did Hartwell say?" "He asked for time to think it over. Blackwood gave him until Sunday morning to decide. That's 3 days from now." Daniel's young face was pale with distress. "Mr. Whitmore, Catherine don't know anything about this yet. She thinks her father's looking for work in the next county over. But I saw what happens to girls who end up working for Blackwood. They don't last long, and they sure don't ever get out." Thomas felt a familiar cold fury building in his chest, the same anger that had driven him to stand against corruption before. But this time, it wasn't about school board politics or educational reform. This was about a young woman's life and dreams being bartered away like cattle. "Thank you for telling me, Daniel. You took a risk coming here. Catherine helped my little sister learn to read last year when there wasn't any teacher in town. She's a good people, Mr. Whitmore. Don't deserve what's coming." After Daniel left, Thomas paced his small room like a caged wolf. Mrs. Crawford remained in the doorway, watching him with knowing eyes. "You're thinking of doing something foolish," she observed. "I'm thinking of doing something necessary. Same thing in my experience." She sighed heavily. "What do you have in mind?" Thomas stopped pacing and faced her. "I need to know everything. About Silas Blackwood, his business, his methods, his weaknesses, and I need to know tonight." Mrs. Crawford studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Come downstairs. We'll need coffee for this conversation." In the boarding house kitchen, Mrs. Crawford poured strong black coffee and began to paint a picture of Millfield's most dangerous man. Silas Blackwood had arrived in town 5 years earlier with a considerable bankroll and no visible past. He purchased the Silver Dollar Saloon, expanded it into a gambling hall, and gradually extended his influence throughout the community. He's not just a businessman, Mrs. Crawford explained. He's the unofficial law in Millfield. Sheriff Morrison's in his pocket, along with most of the town council. Blackwood lends money to desperate folks at reasonable rates initially, then who changes the terms when they can't pay. That's how he's acquired half the property in town. And the girls who work for him? Mrs. Crawford's expression darkened. Some come willingly, looking for easy money. Others arrive like Catherine's about. To payment for family debts. Once they're there, Blackwood makes sure they stay. Debt bondage, threats against family members, sometimes worse. Has anyone ever tried to stop him? 3 men over the years. One left town in the middle of the night after his house burned. Down. Another had a riding accident that left him permanently crippled. The third, she shook her head. They found him in the river, supposedly drunk and drowned. Nobody believed it, but nobody spoke up either. Thomas absorbed this information. While formulating a plan, confronting Blackwood directly would be suicide, but there had to be another way. What about Catherine herself? If she knew what her father was planning, where would she go? A 17-year-old girl with no money and no family except the father who betrayed her. Blackwood would track her down within days, and then her situation would be even worse. Thomas stared into his coffee cup, seeing Catherine's intelligent eyes and passionate love of learning. The thought of that bright spirit being crushed in Blackwood's establishment made his jaw clench with determination. There might be another option, he said slowly. I'm listening. What if Catherine wasn't available when Blackwood came to collect? Mrs. Crawford raised an eyebrow. Are you planning to kidnap the girl? I'm planning to offer her a choice her father won't give her. A chance to escape before the trap closes. The next morning, Thomas arrived at the schoolhouse early and waited. Catherine appeared promptly at 8 o'clock, but something was different about her demeanor. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usual quiet confidence seemed strained. Good. Morning, Miss Hartwell, Thomas said gently. You look tired. Are you feeling well? She managed a wan smile. Just family concerns, Mr. Whitmore. Nothing that should interfere with my studies. Thomas watched her carefully throughout the morning. Catherine helped the younger students with their lessons as usual, but her attention kept drifting to the window, as if she were watching for someone. During the lunch break, when the other children went home to eat, she remained at her desk, staring at an open book without reading. Catherine, Thomas said quietly, moving to sit at the desk beside her. Is there something you'd like to talk about? She looked up, and he saw tears threatening in her dark eyes. Mr. Whitmore, what would you do if you knew something terrible was going to happen, but you were powerless to stop it? I'd look for allies. Powerlessness is often an illusion created by fear and isolation. But what if fighting back would only make things worse for everyone you care about? Thomas chose his words carefully. Sometimes the greatest courage is trusting others to help carry a burden that's too heavy for one person alone. Catherine studied his face intently, as if searching for something she could trust. Finally, she spoke in a whisper barely audible above the wind outside. My father's been meeting with Silas Blackwood about his debts. He thinks I don't know, but I heard them talking last night when he thought I was asleep. Her voice broke slightly. Mr. Blackwood has a proposal that would solve all our financial problems. What kind of proposal? The kind that would end my dreams of ever becoming a teacher. The kind that would make me into something I never wanted to be. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Father says he's still considering his options, but I can see it in his face. He's already decided. Thomas felt his heart breaking for this brilliant young woman trapped by circumstances beyond her control. Catherine, what if I told you there might be another way? Hope flickered in her eyes, quickly followed by wariness. What do you mean? I mean that you have more choices than your father and Silas Blackwood want you to believe. You're not property to be sold or traded. You're a human being with rights and dreams that matter. Rights don't mean much when you're 17 and female and poor, Mr. Whitmore. They mean everything to people who are willing to defend them." Thomas leaned forward, speaking with quiet intensity. "Catherine, I've taught in 7 different towns across the frontier. I've seen young people trapped by circumstances that seemed impossible to escape. But I've also seen them find ways to freedom when someone was willing to help. Help how?" Thomas took a deep breath, knowing he was about to cross a line from which there could be no return. There are teaching positions available in other territories, places where a young woman with your skills and dedication could find honest work and continue her education, places where Silas Blackwood has no influence. Catherine's eyes widened. "You're talking about running away." "I'm talking about choosing your own future instead of accepting the one others would force upon you." "But your father made his choice when he decided to gamble with money he couldn't afford to lose. You don't have to pay the price for his mistakes." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the mountains that surrounded Millfield like prison walls. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger. "Where would I go? How would I survive? I have contacts in Denver, teachers, who could help you find a position as an assistant instructor while you continue your own education. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be honest work, and it would be yours. And you? What would happen to you if you helped me escape?" Thomas smiled grimly. "I've run out of towns before for doing what I thought was right. I can handle whatever consequences come." Catherine looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Why would you risk everything for someone you barely know? Because every student I've ever taught was someone's daughter, someone's hope for a better future. Because I became a teacher to help young people reach their potential, not to stand by while that potential is destroyed." Thomas paused, then added quietly, "And because I once had a sister who faced a similar situation, and I was too young and powerless to help her. I won't make that mistake again." The afternoon passed in tense silence as Catherine wrestled with the most important decision of her young life. Thomas continued teaching the other students, but his attention remained focused on the young woman, whose future hung in the balance. As the school day ended and the younger children departed, Catherine approached Thomas's desk with determined steps. "If I agreed to this plan," she said quietly, "when would we leave?" "Tomorrow night. After dark, when the town is asleep. I have a wagon and supplies cached outside town, enough to get us to the main road toward Denver." "And you're certain there would be work for me there?" "I'm certain there are people there who value education and would give you a chance to prove yourself. The rest would be up to you." Catherine nodded slowly. "I need to think about it. Give me until tomorrow evening to decide." "Of course. But, Catherine, whatever you choose, don't tell your father. If Blackwood learns of our conversation, I understand." She gathered her books and moved toward the door, then turned back. "Mr. Whitmore, regardless of what I decide, thank you for showing me that I have choices. That alone is a gift more valuable than any book you could lend me." After she left, Thomas sat alone in the empty schoolhouse, surrounded by the tools of his trade, but facing a situation that books and blackboards couldn't solve. Tomorrow evening, Catherine would make her choice, and that choice would determine not just her future, but his own. He thought about his sister Sarah, barely 18, when she faced her own impossible situation in a mining town much like Millfield. She had made a different choice, one that haunted him still. This time things would be different. This time he would be ready to fight for what was right, regardless of the cost. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, and somewhere in town, Silas Blackwood was probably counting the hours until Sunday morning, when he expected to collect his human payment for Marcus Hartwell's debts. But Thomas Whitmore had other plans, and if Catherine chose freedom over submission, those plans would transform them both from teacher and student into fugitives racing. Toward an uncertain but self-determined future, the die was cast. Now all that remained was to see how it would fall. That evening, Thomas walked the streets of Millfield with apparent casualness, but his sharp eyes catalogued every detail that might prove useful. He noted the position of the Silver Dollar Saloon, the back alleys that could provide escape routes, and the patrol patterns of Sheriff Morrison's deputies. The town took on a different character after dark. Shadows seemed deeper, whispers carried farther, and danger lurked behind every lit window. He paused outside the general store where a notice board displayed various announcements and advertisements. Among the usual postings for livestock sales and mining claims, one particular notice caught his attention. It was a reward poster offering $50 for information leading to the capture of undesirable elements disrupting the peace and prosperity of Millfield. The poster bore Silas Blackwood's signature at the bottom, confirming Mrs. Crawford's assertion that the man controlled more than just his saloon. Thomas memorized the wording carefully. Blackwood was already positioning himself to justify future actions against anyone who might interfere with his business interests. This wasn't a man who left things to chance or allowed opposition to flourish unchecked. Continuing his reconnaissance, Thomas discovered that the Silver Dollar occupied a strategic position in the town's layout. It sat at the intersection of Main Street and Commerce Avenue, with clear sightlines in all directions. More importantly, it had only two entrances, the main doors facing the street and a service entrance in the rear that connected to a narrow alley running behind the building. Through the saloon's windows, Thomas could see the establishment was busy, despite the late hour. Cowboys, miners, and merchants gathered around card tables, while painted women moved between them, serving drinks and offering companionship. In the back corner, barely visible through the tobacco smoke, sat a large man in an expensive suit who could only be Silas Blackwood himself. Even from a distance, Blackwood radiated the kind of cold authority that came from absolute power within a small domain. He was perhaps 45 years old, with graying temples and the soft physique of a man who let others do his physical work. But his eyes, when they swept the room, missed nothing. This was a predator at the top of his food chain, comfortable in his dominance and utterly ruthless in maintaining it. Thomas watched as Marcus Hartwell entered the saloon through the main doors, hat in hand and shoulders bowed with defeat. The man looked like he had aged a decade in the past week, his face gaunt and his clothes hanging loose on his diminished frame. He approached Blackwood's table with the reluctant steps of a condemned man walking to the gallows. The conversation was brief. Thomas couldn't hear the words, but body language told the story clearly enough. Hartwell sat hunched forward, occasionally nodding or shaking his head in response to Blackwood's measured statements. At one point, the saloon owner leaned back in his chair and smiled, the kind of smile a cat might wear while playing with a wounded mouse. When the meeting ended, Hartwell stumbled from the saloon like a man who had just signed his soul away. He passed within 10 feet of Thomas without seeing him, lost in his own private hell of guilt and rationalization. Watching him go, Thomas felt a mixture of pity and disgust. He understood the desperation that drove men to impossible choices, but he couldn't forgive the willingness to sacrifice an innocent daughter to preserve one's own skin. Thomas made his way back to the boarding house, where Mrs. Crawford waited with a pot of fresh coffee and a grim expression. "Well?" she asked without preamble. "Hartwell's made his decision. He met with Blackwood tonight, and judging by his expression afterward, the deal is done." Mrs. Crawford poured coffee with sharp, angry movements. "That poor girl. Does she know?" "She suspects, but I don't think she knows how little time she has left." Thomas accepted the steaming cup gratefully. "Mrs. Crawford, I need to ask you something that might put you in danger." "I figured as much. Ask away." "If Catherine and I disappear tomorrow night, how long before Blackwood comes looking for answers?" "Not long. He's got informants throughout the town. Someone will have seen you talking to her, putting ideas in her head." She studied his face carefully. "You're really going through with this, aren't you?" "I don't see any alternative. That girl deserves a chance at the life she's dreamed of, not the nightmare her father's chosen for her." "And if Blackwood catches you before you reach safety?" Thomas's expression grew cold. "Then I'll make sure Catherine escapes, whatever the cost to myself." Mrs. Crawford nodded approvingly. "Good. A man needs to know what he's willing to die for. But let's make sure it doesn't come to that." She moved to a cabinet and withdrew a heavy cloth bundle. "This belonged to my late husband. He was a lawman before he became a boarding house keeper." She unwrapped the bundle to reveal a Colt .45 revolver, well-maintained and loaded. Beside it lay a gun belt with extra ammunition and a leather holster worn smooth by years of use. "I can't take this," Thomas protested. "If Blackwood discovers you helped us, then I'll face whatever comes. I've been watching that monster destroy this town piece by piece for 5 years. Maybe it's time someone reminded him that not everyone can be bought or intimidated." She pressed the gun belt into his hands. "Besides, you'll need more than good intentions if you run into trouble on the trail." Thomas accepted the weapon with reluctant gratitude. He had learned to shoot during his ranch days, though he had never fired a gun in anger. The weight of the revolver felt foreign on his hip, a reminder that his quiet life as an educator was about to become something far more dangerous. "There's something else," Mrs. Crawford continued. "A friend of mine runs a way station about 30 miles north of here on the road to Denver. Emily Garrison, good woman, strong principles. If you can reach her place, she'll help you get the rest of the way safely." "How can you be certain?" "Because Emily's daughter faced a similar situation 3 years ago in a mining camp up in Wyoming. A group of teachers helped her escape to California, where she's now working as a governess for a wealthy family. Emily believes in giving girls like Catherine a fighting chance." Thomas committed the name and location to memory. 30 miles was a hard ride, especially if they were being pursued, but it was achievable if they had enough of a head start. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Thomas conducted his classes with mechanical precision, his mind constantly focused on the evening ahead. Catherine attended as usual, but the strain was evident in every line of her body. She participated in lessons with her customary intelligence, but her thoughts were clearly elsewhere. During the lunch break, she approached his desk with a folded piece of paper. "My answer," she said simply, placing it in his hand. Thomas unfolded the note and read 3 words written in Catherine's careful script. "I choose freedom." Below that, she had added, "Whatever happens, thank you for believing I was worth saving." Relief and apprehension warred in Thomas's chest. Catherine had made her choice, but now the real danger began. He looked up to find her watching him with steady determination. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. "More certain than I've ever been about anything in my life." Her voice was calm, but he could see the fear she was working to control. "What do I need to do?" "Meet me at the old mill ruins north of town at midnight. Bring only what you can carry in a small bag, essential clothes, any personal items you can't bear to leave behind. We'll travel light and fast. What about you? What will you tell people when both of us disappear?" "I'll leave a letter explaining that I've accepted a teaching position elsewhere and departed suddenly due to a family emergency." "It won't fool Blackwood for long, but it might buy us a few hours' head start." Catherine nodded, then surprised him by reaching across the desk to clasp his hand briefly. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore, for everything." As evening approached, Thomas made his final preparations. He packed his essential belongings into saddlebags, leaving behind most of his books and personal effects to maintain the illusion of a hasty but temporary departure. He wrote letters to the school board and several parents, explaining his sudden resignation in terms that would raise no immediate suspicions. At 11:30, he saddled his horse and led it quietly through mill fields, back streets toward the mill ruins. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate, but also making concealment more difficult. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every sound carried the potential of discovery. The old mill had been abandoned for 2 years, a victim of the silver mine closures that had devastated the local economy. Its broken water wheel stood like a monument to failed dreams, while the main building sagged under the weight of accumulated snow and neglect. Thomas arrived first and waited in the shadows, his hand resting on the unfamiliar weight of the borrowed revolver. Minutes passed like hours until he heard soft footsteps approaching through the darkness. Catherine emerged from the gloom, carrying a small canvas bag and wearing a heavy coat that made her appear younger and more vulnerable than her. 17 years. She had braided her hair tightly and covered it with a dark scarf that would help disguise her appearance during their journey. "I was afraid you might change your mind," Thomas admitted as she approached. "I was afraid you might change yours." She managed a nervous smile. "Are you ready for this, Mr. Whitmore? Once we leave, there's no going back. I've been ready since the moment I decided you deserved better than what this town had planned for you." They mounted their horses and rode north into the wilderness, leaving behind the flickering lights of Millfield and heading toward an uncertain but self-determined future. The die had indeed been cast, and now their lives would be shaped by how well they could stay ahead of the consequences of their choice. Behind them, the town slept on, unaware that its newest teacher and most promising student had just embarked on a journey that would test everything they believed about courage, justice, and the price of freedom. The mountain trail stretched before them like a silver ribbon in the moonlight, winding through stands of pine and aspen that whispered secrets to the night wind. Thomas rode slightly ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the path for obstacles or signs of pursuit, while Catherine followed on her borrowed mare with the quiet determination of someone who had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. They had been riding for 2 hours when Thomas called the first halt, choosing a sheltered grove where a small stream provided water for the horses. Catherine dismounted stiffly, unaccustomed to long hours in the saddle, but made no complaint as she helped tend to the animals. "How are you holding up?" Thomas asked, studying her face in the dappled moonlight filtering through the trees. "Better than I expected." Catherine's voice carried a note of surprise, as if she were discovering reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I keep thinking I should be more frightened, but mostly I feel liberated." Thomas understood the feeling. The moment they had ridden out of Millfield, he had felt a familiar sensation of doors closing behind him and unknown possibilities opening ahead. It was the same feeling he'd experienced when leaving each of his previous teaching positions, but this time it carried additional weight. This time he wasn't just changing his own life, he was responsible for Catherine's future as well. "We should reach the way station by dawn if we maintain this pace," he said, checking his pocket watch by the pale light. "Mrs. Garrison will provide fresh horses and supplies for the next leg of our journey." Catherine knelt by the stream, cupping the cold water in her hands to drink. "What happens if she's not there? Or if she refuses to help?" "Then we continue on our own. I have enough supplies to reach Denver, though it will mean traveling more slowly and carefully." Thomas secured the water canteen to his saddle. "But Mrs. Crawford seemed confident that Emily Garrison could be trusted. Mrs. Crawford has been very kind to help us." I hope our escape doesn't bring trouble to her door. Eleanor Crawford has been handling trouble since before either of us was born. She can take care of herself." They remounted and continued north, climbing steadily into the higher elevations where the air grew thin and sharp with the promise of early snow. The horses' hooves rang against exposed rock, the sound echoing off canyon walls that rose like dark sentinels on either side of the narrow trail. As they rode, Catherine began to talk, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. She spoke of her dreams of becoming a teacher, of the books she had read in secret by candlelight, of the small school she hoped someday to establish where girls could learn alongside boys without shame or limitation. "I used to imagine myself standing before a classroom," she said, her voice carrying across the stillness, "not just teaching reading and arithmetic, but helping students discover what they were truly capable of becoming. I wanted to be the kind of teacher who saw potential in every child, regardless of their background or circumstances." Thomas smiled at the passion in her voice. "You still can be. This isn't the end of your dreams, Catherine. It's just a different path to reaching them. Do you really believe that, or are you just trying to keep my spirits up?" "I absolutely believe it. I've seen your natural ability with children, your patience and creativity in explaining difficult concepts. You have everything it takes to be an exceptional educator. What you needed was simply the opportunity to develop those talents without interference." They created a ridge and paused to rest the horses while taking in the view spread below them. The valley floor was carpeted with early morning mist, and in the distance the lights of a small settlement twinkled like earthbound stars. "Is that it?" Catherine asked, pointing toward the lights. "That should be Garrison's Cross, the way station Mrs. Crawford mentioned. We're having a better time than I hoped." But as they descended toward the settlement, Thomas noticed something that made him rein in his horse suddenly. Smoke was rising from what appeared to be the main building, not the thin wisps of morning cooking fires, but the thick, dark columns that spoke of serious destruction. "Something's wrong," he muttered, reaching for the field glasses in his saddlebags. Through the lenses, he could see the source of the smoke. The way station's barn was ablaze, flames licking hungrily at the wooden structure, while dark figures moved about the yard. Even at this distance, Thomas could make out the purposeful movements of men conducting a search rather than fighting a fire. "What is it?" Catherine asked, noting the tension in his posture. "Trouble. Someone's reached the way station ahead of us." Thomas lowered the glasses, his mind racing through possibilities. Either coincidence or Blackwood anticipated. "Our route?" Catherine's voice was steady despite the implications. "What do we do?" Thomas studied the terrain around the settlement, noting the various approaches and potential escape routes. The direct path would take them straight into whatever trouble awaited at the way station, but circling around would cost precious time they might not have. "We can't help Mrs. Garrison if she's in danger, not against unknown numbers. Our best option is to circle east and continue toward Denver by a different route." He folded the field glasses carefully. "It means traveling through rougher country, with no resupply, but—" "Wait." Catherine held up a hand, her head tilted as if listening to something he couldn't hear. "Do you hear that?" Thomas strained his ears and caught it, the distant sound of gunfire echoing off the canyon walls. Single shots, spaced deliberately, as if someone were signaling rather than fighting. 3 shots, pause, 2 shots, pause, 3 shots again, Catherine observed. "That's a pattern, not random violence." Thomas counted the sequence as it repeated. "You're right, someone's trying to communicate." He made a decision that went against every instinct for caution. "We're going down there, but carefully. Stay behind me and be ready to run if things go badly." They approached the settlement using what cover the terrain provided, moving from boulder to grove to shadowed ravine. As they drew closer, the scene became clearer and more ominous. The barn was indeed destroyed, still smouldering in the early morning air, but the main house appeared intact. Several horses were tied outside, their saddles bearing the distinctive silver conchos that marked them as property of the Silver Dollar Saloon. "Blackwood's men," Thomas whispered. "But why burn the barn and leave the house standing?" His question was answered moments later when the front door of the way station opened, and two men emerged, dragging a woman between them. Even at a distance, Thomas could see she was middle-aged, with greying hair and a defiant bearing that suggested this was Emily Garrison herself. One of the men, tall and lean with a black hat, called out in a voice that carried clearly across the morning stillness. "We know you're out there, schoolteacher. Come down peacefully like and nobody else gets hurt." Catherine gasped softly. "They're using her as bait, which means they know exactly who we are and where we were headed." Thomas's jaw tightened as he watched Mrs. Garrison struggle against her captors. "Someone in Millfield talked, or Blackwood's network of informants is more extensive than we realized." The lean man continued his shouting. "You got 5 minutes to show yourself, or this lady's going to have an unfortunate accident. Same kind of thing that might happen to that boarding house woman back in town if you don't cooperate." The threat against Mrs. Crawford sent a surge of cold anger through Thomas's veins. Blackwood wasn't just pursuing them, he was systematically eliminating anyone who had helped them, ensuring that future acts of defiance would find no support. "I have to go down there," Thomas said quietly. "That's exactly what they want. The moment you show yourself, they'll shoot you and take me back to Blackwood." "Maybe, but I can't let innocent people suffer for my choices." Thomas checked his revolver, ensuring the chambers were loaded. "Besides, they need me alive long enough to tell them where you are. That gives me some advantage." Catherine grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear and determination. "There has to be another way. You said yourself that charging into an unknown situation is suicide. Then help me think of an alternative, fast." Catherine studied the scene below with the same analytical intensity she brought to solving mathematical problems in the classroom. "How many men can you count?" 3 visible, but there could be more inside the house, or positioned as lookouts. The barn fire, it's still smoking heavily. If the wind were to shift... Thomas followed her gaze and understood immediately. The prevailing wind was currently carrying the smoke away from the house, but the canyon walls created unpredictable air, currents that could change direction quickly. "A distraction," he murmured. "But how do we control the wind?" "We don't control it, we create our own." Catherine pointed to a stand of dry brush uphill from the settlement. "If we set a fire there, the thermal currents will draw the smoke down toward the house. In the confusion, I could get close enough to free Mrs. Garrison." Thomas nodded approvingly. "It's risky, but it might work. Can you handle lighting the fire while I move into position?" "I can handle it." Catherine's voice carried a note of steel that reminded Thomas she was no longer the frightened girl he had first met in his classroom. "But what if something goes wrong? What if they see you coming? Then you ride hard for Denver and don't look back. Find the Teachers Association office on Larimer Street and tell them Thomas Whitmore sent you. They'll help you get established." Catherine shook her head firmly. "We started this together, and we're going to finish it together. If you're captured, I'm not abandoning you." "Catherine, no arguments, Mr. Whitmore. You taught me that education is about making choices based on knowledge and principle. Well, I choose to stand by the man who risked everything to give me a future." Thomas looked at her with a mixture of pride and exasperation. The frightened, submissive girl was gone completely, replaced by a young woman who had discovered her own courage and refused to be dissuaded from using it. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this smart and careful, no unnecessary risks." They split up, Catherine working her way uphill toward the dry brush, while Thomas circled around to approach the settlement from the east. The morning air was crisp and still, carrying the acrid scent of the burned barn and the nervous whickering of horses sensing their riders' tension. Thomas found a position behind a fallen log about 50 yards from the house, close enough to act when the moment came, but concealed from casual observation. From this vantage point he could see Mrs. Garrison more clearly. Her hands were bound, but she stood straight and proud despite her circumstances. Whatever threats had been made, her spirit remained unbroken. The lean man in the black hat was growing impatient, pacing back and forth while barking orders at his companions. "Check the ridgeline again. They got to be up there somewhere." One of the other men, stockier and wearing a coat with brass buttons, shook his head. "Maybe they doubled back, went another direction entirely. Boss says they'd head for this place." "Boss is never wrong about such things." The lean man's voice carried an edge of fear beneath the bluster. "We find them, or we answer to Blackwood personally. You want to explain to him how a schoolteacher and a slip of a girl outsmarted us?" Thomas smiled grimly at the man's obvious nervousness. Silas Blackwood might rule Millfield through fear and intimidation, but even his own men were terrified of disappointing him. That fear could be used as a weapon if the opportunity arose. Faint wisp of smoke appeared on the hillside above the settlement. Catherine had succeeded in lighting her fire. Within minutes, the wind patterns began to shift as warm air rose from the burning brush and cooler air rushed in to replace it. The thick smoke from the barn fire started to swirl and drift toward the house. "What the hell?" The lean man squinted uphill, trying to locate the source of the new smoke. "Charlie, get up there and see what's burning." As the designated Charlie started up the hill and the smoke thickened around the settlement, Thomas made his move. He sprinted from cover to cover, using outbuildings and scattered equipment to mask his approach. The acrid haze provided excellent concealment, but it also made navigation treacherous. He reached the side of the house just as shouts erupted from multiple directions. Catherine's fire had spread faster than anticipated, and now the men were dealing with the very real possibility of the settlement being consumed by flames. "Forget the damn fire!" the lean man yelled. "Find that schoolteacher!" Thomas rounded the corner of the house to find Mrs. Garrison still held by her original captor, while the other men scattered to fight the spreading blaze. The moment was perfect. One guard distracted by the chaos, the others occupied elsewhere. Thomas drew his revolver and stepped into the open. "Let her go." The guard spun toward him, reaching for his own weapon, but Thomas was faster. The shot echoed across the settlement like thunder, and the man crumpled to the ground, clutching his shoulder. "Are you hurt?" Thomas asked Mrs. Garrison as he cut her bonds with his pocket knife. "Nothing that won't heal," she replied with remarkable composure. "But you need to know they're not the only ones. Blackwood sent riders in 3 directions, covering all the possible routes to Denver." "How many?" "At least a dozen men, maybe more, and they have orders to bring the girl back alive, but dispose of anyone helping her." Thomas absorbed this information while helping Mrs. Garrison toward the horses. The situation was worse than he had imagined. They weren't just fleeing a local threat, but running from a coordinated manhunt with resources far beyond anything he had anticipated. "Where's Catherine?" Mrs. Garrison asked. "Creating our distraction. She should be—" Catherine's voice rang out from somewhere in the smoke. "Mr. Whitmore, we have company." Through the haze, Thomas could see new riders approaching from the south. Reinforcements arriving at exactly the wrong moment. The careful plan was collapsing into chaos, and their window of escape was closing rapidly. The real chase was about to begin. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats cut through the morning air, like a death knell as Thomas helped Mrs. Garrison onto one of the horses tied outside her burning way station. Through the thickening smoke, he could count at least 6 riders cresting the southern ridge, their mounts lathered with sweat from hard riding. "Catherine!" Thomas shouted into the haze. "We're leaving now!" Her voice came back faint, but determined. "I can see them from up here. There's another group coming from the west." Thomas cursed under his breath. Blackwood had indeed planned for multiple escape routes, positioning his men to create an ever-tightening net around their quarry. The tactical brilliance of it was infuriating and terrifying. Mrs. Garrison, despite her ordeal, proved to be an experienced rider. She quickly took control of her mouth, while Thomas fired 2 warning shots toward the approaching riders, buying precious seconds as they sought cover from what they assumed was an ambush. "The Eastern Trail!" Mrs. Garrison called over the sound of crackling flames. "It's treacherous, but it leads to Copper Canyon. If we can reach the old mining roads—" Thomas didn't wait to hear the rest. He spurred his horse toward the hillside, where Catherine's signal fire was spreading faster than intended. The dry autumn brush caught flame with explosive intensity, creating a wall of heat and smoke that would soon consume the entire slope. He found Catherine fighting her way down through the burning undergrowth, her coat singed and her face streaked with soot. Her horse danced nervously at the edge of the fire zone, eyes rolling white with fear. "The fire's out of control," she gasped as Thomas reached her. "I didn't think it would spread so quickly." "Natural fire breaks will stop it before it reaches the valley," Thomas said, though he wasn't entirely certain. "Right now, it's our best protection. Mount up." They galloped back toward Mrs. Garrison, who had positioned herself near a rocky outcropping that would provide cover from rifle fire. The first group of Blackwood's men had reached the settlement and were shouting orders to each other through the smoke, their voices carrying notes of confusion and frustration. "There!" one of them yelled. "3 riders heading east." Gunfire erupted behind them as they fled toward the canyon trail Mrs. Garrison had indicated. Bullets whined off rocks and splintered tree branches, but the smoke and growing distance made accurate shooting impossible. Still, Thomas knew their pursuers would follow relentlessly. Blackwood's reputation depended on completing assignments regardless of obstacles. The Eastern Trail proved to be everything Mrs. Garrison had warned, and worse. It wound along the face of a sheer cliff, barely wide enough for a single horse, with loose stone that shifted treacherously underfoot. One false step meant a 100-foot fall onto jagged rocks below. Catherine rode behind Thomas, her scholar's mind working to process their situation, even as her body adjusted to the demands of desperate flight. "How many men does Blackwood have?" she called over the wind whistling through the canyon. "More than enough," Mrs. Garrison replied grimly. "He's been recruiting throughout the territory for months. Gun hands, trackers, men who ask no questions. As long as they're paid regularly, then we can't outrun them indefinitely. We need to outthink them." Thomas smiled despite their circumstances. Even in mortal danger, Catherine approached problems with the analytical mind that would make her an exceptional teacher, if they lived long enough for her to realize that dream. The trail descended into Copper Canyon, where the remnants of failed mining operations dotted the landscape like broken teeth. Abandoned equipment rusted beside played-out claims, and the skeletal remains of a stamp mill cast eerie shadows in the morning light. But more importantly, a network of old mining roads, branched in multiple directions, offering choices that might confuse their pursuers. "Which way?" Thomas asked as they paused at a 3-way intersection marked by a weathered signpost. Mrs. Garrison studied the options. "North leads to the main road to Denver, but it's the obvious choice. They'll have men positioned there. South circles back toward Millfield, suicidal. West goes deeper into the mountains, toward abandoned silver claims. Rough country, but I know those trails." "West it is," Thomas decided. "We need distance and confusion more than speed right now." They had barely entered the Western Trail when the sound of pursuit echoed through the canyon. Their hunters had navigated the cliff path faster than expected, driven by fear of Blackwood's wrath and the promise of significant rewards for success. The mining road climbed steadily through stands of aspen and pine, the autumn leaves creating a golden carpet that muffled hoofbeats but also made tracking easier. Thomas realized they were leaving a trail a child could follow, But there was no alternative except to push deeper into the wilderness and hope their knowledge of the terrain would prove superior to their enemies' numbers. After 2 hours of hard riding, they reached an abandoned mining camp perched on a mountainside like an eagle's nest. The buildings were mostly intact, a testament to the high-quality construction prompted by optimistic investors who had believed the silver veins would last forever. "We need to rest the horses," Mrs. Garrison said, dismounting near what had once been the camp's general store. "They're blown, and we've got steep climbing ahead." Thomas checked his pocket watch. Nearly 9 in the morning. They had been running for 4 hours, and their pursuers showed no signs of giving up. If anything, the delay at the way station had given Blackwood's men time to organize a more systematic search. Catherine explored the abandoned buildings while the horses recovered, her natural curiosity overcoming the exhaustion that lined her face. She emerged from the old assay office carrying a leather-bound ledger and several maps. "Look at this," she said, spreading one of the maps on a convenient stump. "These mining claims extend for miles in every direction. There are tunnels, equipment, roads, even a narrow-gauge railroad that connects to the main line." Thomas studied the map with growing excitement. "The railroad, is it still functional?" "According to this survey from 3 years ago, the tracks were intact, but the rolling stock was removed." Catherine traced the rail line with her finger. "But the roadbed would still be passable on horseback, and it leads directly toward the Denver Basin." Mrs. Garrison joined them, her expression thoughtful. "I remember that line. It follows Dead Man's Creek down to the flatlands and comes out near Morrison. From there, it's an easy ride to Denver on good roads." "How far?" Thomas asked. 20 miles, maybe 25. But the railroad bed runs through some of the roughest countries in the territory. Steep grades, narrow cuts through solid rock. If Blackwood's men catch us in one of those confined spaces, we'll be trapped like rats in a tunnel," Thomas finished. "But if we can stay ahead of them, we'll reach safety while they're still searching the mining roads." The decision was made itself. They filled their canteens from a mountain spring, allowed the horses a brief rest and handful of grain, then set off toward the abandoned railroad line. The trail was difficult to follow at first, overgrown with brush and obscured by rock slides, but eventually they found the roadbed itself, twin ribbons of rusted steel stretching into the distance like a promise of salvation. Riding the railroad was surreal. The horses' hooves rang against wooden ties with a rhythmic clatter that seemed to announce their passage to the world, while the perfectly graded roadbed allowed them to maintain a steady pace despite the challenging terrain. High walls of stone rose on either side, carved by immigrant workers whose bones now rested in forgotten graveyards throughout the West. But the confined space also amplified every sound, including the growing noise of pursuit echoing from somewhere. Behind them, Blackwood's men had found the railroad entrance and were following with grim determination. "They're gaining," Mrs. Garrison observed, glancing back at the curve that hid their hunters from view. "We need to reach the trestle before they catch us in these rock cuts." "What trestle?" Catherine asked. "Crosses Dead Man's Creek about 5 miles ahead. It's a wooden structure, maybe 80 feet high. If we can damage it after we cross..." Thomas understood immediately. "We could delay pursuit for hours while they find another route, but how do we destroy a railroad trestle without explosives?" "Fire," Catherine said quietly. "Those wooden supports have been drying in mountain air for years. They'd burn like kindling, and if the fire spreads beyond the trestle, then we create a natural barrier that even Blackwood's men can't cross easily." Her voice carried the same determination that had driven her to escape Millfield in the first place. "Sometimes the only choice is between certain capture and calculated risk." The trestle appeared around a curve, like something from a fever dream. A spider web of wooden beams and iron bolts spanning a deep gorge carved by centuries of spring snowmelt. Far below, Deadman's Creek sparkled in the afternoon sunlight, beautiful and utterly unforgiving to anyone unfortunate enough to fall. They crossed at a careful walk, the horses trembling with nervous energy as the structure swayed slightly under their weight. The engineering was sound, but decades of weather had taken their toll on wood and metal joints that groaned ominously with each step. Once safely across, Thomas and Catherine worked feverishly to gather dry brush and fallen timber while Mrs. Garrison kept watch. The sound of approaching horses grew steadily louder, echoing through the canyon like approaching thunder. "How long do we have?" Thomas asked, stuffing kindling between the trestle's support beams. 5 minutes, maybe less," Mrs. Garrison replied. "I can see dust clouds back there." Catherine had torn pages from the ledger she'd found at the mining camp, creating an excellent tinder that caught fire immediately when touched by a lucifer match. The flames spread quickly through the accumulated debris, climbing up the aged wooden supports with hungry intensity. "It's working!" Catherine exclaimed as the fire took hold. "Look how fast it's spreading," but their celebration was premature. The first of Blackwood's riders appeared at the far end of the trestle just as smoke began to billow from the burning supports. The lead rider, a scarred man with silver hair and cold eyes, raised a rifle and fired. The bullet whined past Thomas's ear, close enough that he felt its passage. "Time to go!" They mounted and spurred their horses away from the burning trestle, racing along the railroad bed as shouts of fury echoed from behind them. The fire was spreading faster than expected, consuming not just the targeted supports, but climbing toward the deck planking, where it would be visible for miles. "They'll have to backtrack at least 10 miles to find another crossing," Mrs. Garrison called over the sound of galloping hooves. "That gives us maybe 2 hours lead, assuming they don't have men positioned ahead of us," Thomas replied. "Blackwood seems to anticipate every move we make." As if summoned by his words, riders appeared on the ridgeline above them, silhouetted against the sky like harbingers of doom. These weren't the same men who had been pursuing them through the canyon. These were fresh horses and rested fighters who had taken a different route to intercept their quarry. "There!" one of them shouted. "On the railroad! Just like the boss predicted." Gunfire erupted from the ridge as Thomas, Catherine, and Mrs. Garrison urged their exhausted horses into one final desperate sprint. Bullets sparked off the steel rails and splintered wooden ties, filling the air with deadly splinters and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The railroad bed curved around a massive boulder, providing momentary shelter from the rifle fire. But Thomas knew their luck was running out. The horses were spent, their ammunition was limited, and they were still miles from safety. "The tunnel!" Mrs. Garrison pointed ahead to where the railroad disappeared into a dark opening carved through solid rock. "If we can reach it, they'll have to follow us on foot." It was their only chance. They raced toward the tunnel mouth as bullets whined around them, the darkness promising either salvation or a perfectly designed trap from which there could be no escape. The sound of hoofbeats echoed off stone walls as they plunged into the mountain's heart, leaving the bright autumn day behind for an uncertain journey through the underground passages that would either deliver them to freedom or become their tomb. The tunnel stretched ahead into absolute darkness, carved through solid granite by Chinese workers whose skill with explosives had opened pathways that seemed impossible. Thomas struck a match, its brief flare revealing walls that glistened with mineral deposits and a ceiling that disappeared into shadow above their heads. "How long is this tunnel?" Catherine asked, her voice distorted by the stone confines. "According to the survey maps, nearly a mile," Mrs. Garrison replied. "It connects to a series of smaller passages that honeycomb this entire mountain. The engineers needed multiple boreholes to manage the grade changes." Behind them, the tunnel mouth had become a rectangle of diminishing light, and within moments they heard the voices of their pursuers echoing through the opening. The men were arguing about whether to follow on horseback or dismount and proceed on foot through the treacherous underground terrain. "They're coming," Thomas said quietly, urging his horse forward into the enveloping darkness. Matchlight will give away our position, but without it, the horses can see better than we can. In this darkness, Mrs. Garrison interrupted, trust them to find the way. Horses have an instinct for safe footing that saved more than one miner's life. They proceeded slowly, their mounts picking careful steps along the uneven railroad bed. Loose stones clattered into unseen depths, and somewhere in the distance, water dripped with the patient persistence of geological time. The air grew colder and thinner, carrying the metallic taste of deep earth and the musty scent of places where sunlight had never penetrated. Catherine rode close behind Thomas, one hand extended to maintain contact with his horse's flank as they navigated the subterranean labyrinth. Despite the danger of their situation, her scholar's mind couldn't help but marvel at the engineering feats surrounding them. The amount of calculation required to bore this tunnel, she murmured, more to herself than to her companions. Surveying angles through solid rock, managing water drainage, ensuring structural stability. It's like a three-dimensional mathematical problem solved in stone and steel. Save the geology lesson for when we're not being hunted, Thomas replied. But his tone carried affection rather than irritation. Even in mortal peril, Catherine's intellectual curiosity remained undimmed. A new sound reached them from behind, the strike of steel horseshoes against stone, indicating their pursuers had decided to risk mounted pursuit despite the dangers. The decision spoke to their desperation. Blackwood's men clearly feared their employer's wrath more than the possibility of a fatal fall in the darkness. They're gaining confidence, Mrs. Garrison observed, probably using torches now that they know we're far enough ahead to avoid immediate confrontation. Thomas considered their options. The tunnel offered concealment, but also trapped them in a confined space with limited escape routes. If Blackwood's men managed to position fighters at both ends, the underground passage would become a killing ground with no possibility of retreat. You mentioned connecting passages, he said to Mrs. Garrison. How many, and where do they lead? 3 main branches, according to the old survey records. One angles northwest toward the original silver claims. Another drops southeast, following a natural cave system that eventually opens near Willow Creek. The third continues straight through to the eastern portal, about 2 miles from here, which offers the best chance of reaching Denver. The southeast passage, if it's still navigable. It comes out closest to the main road, and the terrain beyond is more favorable for fast travel. A decision crystallized in Thomas's mind. Dangerous, but potentially decisive. When we reach the first branch point, we split up. Catherine and I take the southeast passage toward Willow Creek. You continue straight through to the eastern portal. Absolutely not, Catherine said immediately. We don't abandon people who've helped us. It's not abandonment. It's tactics. If our pursuers have to choose which trail to follow, we divide their strength. Mrs. Garrison knows this country better than either of us. She has the best chance of reaching safety on her own. Mrs. Garrison's voice carried a note of approval. The boys, thinking like a cavalry officer, divide the enemy's attention, force them to make choices that weaken their overall position. I don't like it, Catherine said firmly. Too many things could go wrong. Everything about this situation could go wrong, Thomas replied. But staying together guarantees that all of Blackwood's men will focus their efforts on one trail. Separating gives us better odds that at least some of us will escape. Light flickered ahead, not sunlight, but the dancing glow of torches reflecting. Off tunnel walls, they had reached the first major intersection, where 3 passages branched away from the main tunnel like arteries from a heart. The engineering challenge was evident even in the dim light. The intersection required a complex arrangement of supporting timbers and steel girders to prevent the mountain from crushing the artificial caverns. This is it, Mrs. Garrison whispered. Southeast Passage is the narrow opening on the right. It drops sharply for the first 100 yards, then levels out following the underground creek. Thomas dismounted and helped Catherine down from her horse. The animals were showing signs of stress from the underground journey, rolling eyes, nervous snorting, and a reluctance to move deeper into the unnatural environment. "Take my horse," Thomas told Mrs. Garrison. "You'll make better time with a fresh mount." "What about you two?" "Catherine's horse is still strong enough to carry us both for a while. Once we reach the open country, we'll find replacement mounts." Mrs. Garrison clasped Thomas's hand briefly. "You're a good man, Thomas Whitmore. That girl's lucky to have found you." "I'm the lucky one," Thomas replied, glancing at Catherine with a mixture of admiration and protectiveness. "She's taught me more about courage in 3 days than I learned in 7 years of teaching." They could hear their pursuers approaching the intersection, their voices growing louder as torchlight began to illuminate the junction chamber. Time for farewells had run out. Mrs. Garrison spurred her horse into the main tunnel toward the eastern portal, her hoofbeats quickly fading into the distance. Thomas and Catherine led their remaining horse into the southeast passage, which immediately proved to be everything Mrs. Garrison had warned about. The passage dropped at a steep angle, forcing them to dismount and lead their nervous mount down. What amounted to a natural staircase carved from living rock. Water seeped from the walls and pooled in depressions, creating treacherous footing that tested both human and equine balance with every step. "I can hear water running ahead," Catherine observed. "That must be the underground creek Mrs. Garrison mentioned." The sound grew stronger as they descended, eventually becoming the clear music of flowing water, echoing through stone chambers. When they finally reached the creek level, Thomas struck another precious match to survey their surroundings. The passage had opened into a natural cave system carved by millennia of water action. Limestone formations created fantastic shapes. In the brief flare of light, columns, curtains, and delicate crystalline structures that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. The underground creek ran along one side of the chamber, its water clear and cold as mountain snow melt. "Follow the water," Thomas said, extinguishing the match to preserve their remaining supply. "Underground streams always find the easiest route to the surface." They walked their horse along the creek bank, occasionally splashing through shallow sections where the passage narrowed. The air gradually became warmer and carried hints of pine and autumn leaves, signs that they were approaching the surface world. Behind them, voices echoed faintly through the connecting passages. Blackwood's men had reached the intersection and were apparently dividing their forces, as Thomas had hoped. The southeast passage would receive some attention, but not the full weight of their pursuit. "Light ahead," Catherine said softly. Indeed, a faint glow was visible in the distance, not the harsh glare of torches, but the softer illumination of natural daylight filtering through stone. They had been underground for nearly 2 hours, and the prospect of returning to the surface filled them both with relief. The cave mouth opened into a narrow ravine carved by Willow Creek, its walls lined with autumn-touched cottonwoods that provided excellent concealment. More importantly, the sound of running water would mask any noise they made while planning their next move. Thomas helped Catherine mount their horse, then swung up behind her. The double burden would slow their progress, but the animal seemed relieved to be out of the underground maze and stepped forward willingly. "Which direction?" Catherine asked, studying the ravine that stretched both upstream and downstream from their position. "Downstream, toward the main valley. We need to reach the Denver Road before Blackwood's men organize a systematic search of this area." They had ridden perhaps a mile when Catherine suddenly tensed in the saddle. "Listen!" Thomas strained his ears and caught what had alarmed her, the sound of multiple horses moving at speed through the forest above them. Either Mrs. Garrison had been captured and forced to reveal their route, or Blackwood's tactical planning was even more comprehensive than they had feared. "How many?" Thomas whispered. "At least 4, maybe 6. They're paralleling our route but staying in the trees." Thomas urged their horse toward the creek bank, where overhanging willows provided some concealment from observation above. But he knew they couldn't remain hidden indefinitely. Their pursuers would eventually descend to the water level and follow their trail. "We need a new plan," he said quietly. "Something they won't expect." Catherine was quiet for a moment, her analytical mind processing their tactical situation. "What do they expect us to do?" "Continue downstream toward the main road. It's the logical choice. Fastest route to Denver and civilization. Then we do the illogical thing. We go upstream, deeper into the wilderness." Thomas considered the suggestion. It went against every instinct for survival, leading them further from help and into terrain that could prove impassable. But it also represented the kind of unexpected maneuver that might confuse their pursuers long enough to create new opportunities. "It's risky," he said finally. "Everything we've done has been risky. At least this way, we're controlling the risk instead of reacting to choices made by our enemies." Thomas smiled at her logic. "You're going to make a formidable teacher, Catherine. Hartwell. Students will never know what unexpected lesson you'll spring on them next. I hope I live long enough to find out." They turned upstream, following Willow Creek toward its source in the high country. The ravine gradually narrowed and steepened, forcing them to dismount and lead their horse across increasingly treacherous terrain. But the sound of pursuit faded behind them, suggesting their unexpected choice had indeed confused Blackwood's men. As afternoon shadows lengthened toward evening, they climbed out of the ravine onto a high meadow surrounded by peaks that caught the last sunlight like golden crowns. The view was spectacular, miles of wilderness stretching toward the distant plains where Denver waited like a promise of sanctuary. But the immediate landscape offered new challenges. Above the tree line, there was no concealment from observation, and their horse left clear tracks in the soft mountain soil. They were visible for miles to anyone with field glasses and the patience to scan the high country systematically. "We can't stay here," Thomas said, studying the exposed terrain ahead. "But we can't go back either." Catherine pointed toward a saddle between 2 peaks to the northeast. "That passage leads toward the main Denver road, but by a route that would take us miles beyond where they expect to intercept us." "How do you know?" "I studied those survey maps while we were at the mining camp. The topography shows an old Indian trail that connects to the freight road near Morrison. It's marked as difficult passage, seasonal use only, but it's a direct route to the lowlands." Thomas looked at their tired horse, then at the challenging terrain ahead. The animal had served them faithfully through hours of underground travel and miles of rough country, but the high mountain crossing would test its endurance to the limit. "It's our best option," he decided. "Maybe our only option." They began the climb toward the mountain saddle as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Thomas of the evening when this adventure had begun. 3 days ago, he had been a simple schoolteacher, concerned with lesson plans and classroom discipline. Now he was a fugitive, racing against time and weather to deliver a brilliant young woman to the future she deserved. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to save Catherine's dreams of becoming an educator, he had been forced to abandon his own classroom and everything he had worked to build. But as he watched her navigate the treacherous mountain trail with determination and grace, he realized that some lessons could only be taught outside the confines of any schoolhouse. The real test of their courage and their chances of survival lay ahead in the dark hours before dawn, when they would either reach safety or face the final confrontation that would determine whether freedom was worth the price they had been willing to pay. The mountain saddle proved to be a gateway into a realm where autumn had already surrendered to winter's advance guard. Frost glazed the sparse vegetation, and the wind carried the bite of snow that would soon blanket the high peaks in impenetrable white. Thomas and Catherine's breath formed silver clouds as they navigated the treacherous descent on the far side of the pass, their exhausted horse picking its way carefully across loose shale that could trigger a deadly slide with one misplaced step. Dawn was still hours away when they finally reached the tree line, where stunted pines offered some protection from the cutting wind. Catherine had remained silent during the brutal climb, but Thomas could see the toll the journey was taking. Her face was pale with exhaustion, and her hands trembled from the cold despite the thick gloves Mrs. Crawford had provided. "We need to rest," Thomas said, dismounting in a grove that offered shelter from both wind and observation. "The horse can't continue without recovery time." Catherine slid from the saddle with barely controlled grace, her legs nearly buckling as she touched solid ground. "How much farther to the main road?" Thomas studied the terrain visible in the pre-dawn gloom, comparing it to his mental map of the region. 5 miles, maybe 6, but the trail Mrs. Garrison mentioned may be impassable after the recent weather. And if it is, then we continue cross-country until we find another route. Thomas began rubbing down their horse with handfuls of dry grass, working warmth back into the animal's stiffened muscles. "One way or another, we will reach Denver today." A distant sound carried on the morning air, the faint call of a hunting horn echoing across the mountain valleys. Both fugitives froze, recognizing the signal for what it meant. Blackwood's men had regrouped and were conducting a systematic search of the entire region. "They're coordinating now," Catherine observed, her voice tight with controlled fear. "That Horn is calling scattered search parties together." Thomas finished tending their horse and moved to a position where he could observe the valleys below through gaps in the pine branches. What he saw sent ice through his veins that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. Smoke rose from at least 3 locations across the landscape. Not the thin wisps of campfires, but the thick columns that marked buildings being deliberately burned. Blackwood wasn't just pursuing them anymore. He was systematically destroying any shelter or assistance they might find along their escape route. "He's scorching the earth," Thomas muttered, "making sure we have nowhere to run, nowhere to hide." Catherine joined him at his observation post, her sharp eyes quickly cataloguing the destruction visible in the distance. "Those fires, they're marking search sectors. Each column of smoke represents a team that's finished combing their assigned area, which means they're closing the net methodically." Thomas felt the familiar weight of tactical reality settling on his shoulders. "We can't outrun them indefinitely, and now we can't count on finding help from local settlers." The hunting horn sounded again, closer this time, answered by similar calls from other directions. Blackwood's organization was impressive and terrifying in its efficiency. Thomas realized they were facing not just a pursuit, but a military style. "Operation designed to leave no escape route unexplored. We need to change the rules of engagement," Catherine said quietly. Thomas looked at her with surprise. "What do you mean?" "We've been reacting to their moves, letting them dictate the terms of this chase. But I've been thinking about chess problems while we rode, specifically endgame scenarios where one side appears hopelessly outnumbered. And the key is to create complications that force your opponent to make difficult choices. If we can't outrun them, maybe we can outmaneuver them by presenting multiple problems simultaneously." Thomas studied her face, seeing the analytical mind that had made her such an exceptional student now focused on survival tactics. "What kind of complications?" "False trails, diversions, anything that forces them to divide their attention." Catherine. He pulled the survey maps from her coat, spreading them on a flat rock. "Look at the terrain between here and the main road. There are at least 4 possible routes, each with different advantages and risks." Thomas examined the maps by the growing light of dawn. Catherine was right. The landscape offered multiple pathways that could confuse pursuers if used cleverly, but the strategy also carried enormous risks. If we split up again, not split up, create the illusion of splitting up, we take one route but leave evidence suggesting we're taking others, force them to investigate each possibility instead of concentrating their full strength on our actual path. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity, but Thomas could see immediate problems. How do we create false evidence without actually traveling those routes? Catherine smiled with the satisfaction of a student who had solved a particularly challenging equation. Remember the mining camp? I took more than just maps from that office. She produced several items from her coat: a man's work glove, a woman's hair ribbon, and a distinctive brass button that had come loose from Thomas's vest during their underground journey. We plant these along false trails, make it appear we've passed that way. Their trackers will find the evidence and report multiple sightings to Blackwood. While they're investigating phantom leads, we take the most direct route to safety. Thomas felt a surge of admiration for her tactical thinking. It's risky, but it might work. They spent the next hour implementing Catherine's deception plan. Thomas backtracked along two of the alternative routes, carefully placing evidence at strategic points where it would be discovered, but not obviously planted. Meanwhile, Catherine prepared their actual escape route, using techniques she had observed from their pursuers to disguise their real trail. The work was exhausting and nerve-wracking, requiring them to expose themselves repeatedly while laying false clues. But as the sun climbed higher and the hunting horns grew more frequent, Thomas began to believe the strategy might succeed. They were preparing to begin their descent toward the main road when disaster struck without warning. A rifle shot cracked across the mountainside, the bullet striking a pine tree inches from Thomas's head. He spun toward the sound to see a lone rider emerging from a stand of aspen, perhaps 200 yards uphill. Too far for accurate pistol fire, but well within range of the long-barreled rifle the man carried. "Down!" Thomas shouted, diving behind. The nearest boulder as a second shot splintered rock where he had been standing. Catherine scrambled for cover, but their horse, already nervous from the gunfire, reared and broke free from its tether. The animal galloped away down the mountainside, carrying their remaining supplies and water, along with any hope of maintaining their planned pace of travel. "Marcus Hartwell sends his regards," the rifleman called across the distance. "Tell his daughter he's sorry it came to this." Thomas felt Catherine stiffen beside him at the mention of her father's name. The psychological warfare was as effective as the physical threat. Blackwood had deliberately chosen Marcus to participate in his daughter's recapture, ensuring maximum emotional impact. "Don't listen to him," Thomas said quietly. "Your father made his choice. This isn't about forgiveness or family obligation." "I know," Catherine replied, but her voice carried the pain of final betrayal. "I know exactly what this is about." The rifleman was advancing carefully, using natural cover to close the distance while maintaining his tactical advantage. Thomas realized that direct confrontation would be suicide. The man held the high ground, superior firepower, and probably years more experience with violence. "We need to move," he whispered. "Can you see an escape route?" Catherine pointed toward a narrow gully that angled down the mountainside, hidden from the rifleman's current position by an outcropping of granite. "There, but it's exposed for the first 50 yards. On my signal, run for that gully. Don't look back, don't slow down. What about you? I'll provide distraction and follow. Just be ready to move fast." Thomas drew his revolver and waited for the rifleman to expose himself while changing positions. When the moment came, he fired. 3 rapid shots, not aimed to kill at that range, but designed to force his opponent into cover while Catherine made her desperate sprint toward safety. She ran with the fluid grace of someone who had found reserves of strength in extremity, covering the open ground in seconds that seemed to stretch like hours. The rifleman's answering shots kicked up dirt around her flying feet, but the combination of distance and her erratic movement made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Thomas followed the moment she reached the gully, zigzagging across the exposed slope while bullets whined past his ears. He dove into the rocky depression just as a shot struck exactly where his head had been, the nearness of death making his hands shake as he reloaded his weapon. "Are you hit?" Catherine asked, checking him for wounds with hands that trembled only. "Slightly. No, but that was too close." Thomas peered over the gully's rim, trying to locate their attacker. "He's good. Military training, probably cavalry from his tactics. Can we outrun him? Not in this terrain. He has the advantage of mobility and firepower." Thomas made a decision that went against every survival instinct. "We're going to have to fight." Catherine's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "Tell me what to do. Take my backup pistol. If something happens to me, empty the cylinder in his general direction and run. Don't try to aim. Just create enough confusion to escape." He handed her the derringer from his boot, a small but deadly weapon at close range. Catherine accepted it with the same seriousness she had once brought to studying complex mathematical theorems. "Thomas," she said quietly, "if we don't survive this, we're going to survive. I didn't come this far to watch you give up now." The rifleman had resumed his advance, moving with professional caution down the mountainside. Thomas could hear loose stones rattling under his boots, marking his progress even when he remained hidden behind cover. "There's something you should know," Catherine continued, ignoring his reassurance, "about what this journey has meant to me. Save it for when we're safe in Denver. No, I need to say this now. 3 days ago, I was a piece of property being sold to settle a debt. Today, I'm a woman who has discovered she's worth fighting for. That transformation, it's worth whatever price we pay." Thomas looked at her with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. In trying to save her dreams of becoming a teacher, he had watched her become something even more valuable, a person who understood her own worth and refused to accept anything less than dignity. "Catherine Hartwell," he said formally, "it has been my honor to be your teacher, and my privilege to be your student." The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, not just one rider, but several. The hunting horns had done their work, calling reinforcements to the sound of gunfire. Their confrontation with the lone rifleman was about to become a battle against overwhelming odds. "How many?" Catherine asked, listening to the multiple horses moving through the trees above them. "At least 4, maybe more." Thomas checked his ammunition one final time. "They're trying to surround us." The tactical situation was hopeless. Trapped in a narrow gully with limited ammunition against multiple opponents holding the high ground, their chances of survival approached 0. But Thomas had learned something important during their 3-day flight across the wilderness. Sometimes the most important victories had nothing to do with surviving the battle. "Whatever happens," he told Catherine, "you fought for your freedom. No one can take that away from you." "We fought for my freedom," she corrected. "And we're not finished fighting yet." The first of the reinforcements appeared at the gullies. Rim, rifle raised and ready to fire. Thomas aimed his revolver upward, knowing he would get perhaps one shot before superior numbers ended their desperate flight toward the future Catherine deserved. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the mountainside from an entirely different direction. Their hunters had found something else to occupy their attention, something that might just provide the opportunity they needed to turn the tables on their pursuers one final time. The distant gunfire grew more intense, echoing across the mountain. Valleys like the sound of a small war erupting in the wilderness. Thomas held his position at the gully's edge, revolver trained on the rifleman above, but his attention was divided between the immediate threat and the unexpected battle raging somewhere beyond the ridgeline. "That's not hunting," Catherine observed, listening to the sustained volleys rolling across the landscape. "Someone's fighting back." The reinforcements who had been moving to surround their position suddenly seemed uncertain, their attention drawn toward the source of the heavy gunfire. Thomas could hear shouted orders and the sound of horses being wheeled around as Blackwood's men faced an unexpected complication in their carefully orchestrated manhunt. "Federal marshals!" one of the riders called out. "Whole damn cavalry patrol!" Coming up from the main road. The rifleman who had been stalking them, Marcus Hartwell, Thomas realized with grim certainty, cursed loudly enough to be heard across the distance. How the hell did they know to come here? "Doesn't matter," another voice replied. "Blackwood's orders are to finish this and scatter before the law gets close enough to interfere." Thomas felt a surge of hope mixed with desperate calculation. Federal intervention might save their lives, but only if they could survive the next few minutes while Blackwood's men rushed to complete their mission before escaping the approaching authorities. "They're going to attack all at once," he whispered to Catherine. "No more careful stalking. They'll risk everything to end this quickly." Catherine checked the derringer he had given her, her hand steady despite the impossible odds they faced. "Then we make them pay dearly for it." The assault came with shocking suddenness. Marcus Hartwell rose from his concealment and fired rapidly while two mounted men charged down opposite sides of the gully, their rifles blazing. A fourth rider appeared at the gully's mouth, blocking their escape route with deadly efficiency. Thomas met the attack with cold precision born of desperation. His first shot took the nearest rider in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle with a scream that echoed off the rocky walls. Catherine's derringer barked twice, the small caliber bullets forcing the second mounted attacker to swerve wildly as his horse reared in panic. But Marcus Hartwell's rifle spoke with deadly authority, the heavy bullets striking the rocks beside Thomas's head and filling the air with stinging fragments. Thomas rolled sideways and returned fire, his shot going wide but close enough to drive Catherine's father back into cover. "Behind you!" Catherine shouted. Thomas spun to see the fourth. Ryder had dismounted and was approaching the gully on foot, using the rocky terrain for concealment. The man was perhaps 30 yards away and closing fast, his rifle held ready for a killing shot at close range. Thomas had 3 bullets left in his revolver and faced 4 opponents, one of whom carried the added psychological burden of being Catherine's father. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple. He couldn't win this fight through firepower alone. "Catherine," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off the approaching rifleman, "when I give the signal, run toward the sound of that federal gunfire. Don't look back, don't wait for me. I'm not leaving you. You have to. Your dreams, your future as a teacher, they're worth more than my life." "Our dreams," she corrected fiercely. "And our future. I won't abandon the man who taught me I was worth fighting for." The approaching gunman was close enough now that Thomas could see his face, a hard-eyed professional killer who had probably ended more lives than he could count. This wasn't Marcus Hartwell, driven by guilt and desperation, but a cold-blooded predator who killed for money and felt nothing about it. Thomas made his choice. Instead of waiting for the optimal shot, he rose from cover and charged straight at his opponent, gambling everything on surprise and desperation. His revolver roared twice, both shots finding their mark in the gunman's chest and dropping him like a felled tree. But the aggressive move exposed Thomas to Marcus Hartwell's rifle, and Catherine's father didn't hesitate. The heavy bullet caught Thomas in the left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him tumbling back into the gully with blood streaming down his arm. "Thomas!" Catherine's scream of anguish cut through the gunfire like a blade. Marcus Hartwell stood up from his position, rifle reloaded and ready to finish what he had started. For a moment, father and daughter stared at each other across the rocky battlefield. He, with guilt and determination warring in his features. She, with heartbreak and fury blazing in her dark eyes. "It's over, Catherine," Marcus called out, his voice breaking slightly. "Come with me now, and the schoolteacher lives. Keep fighting, and I'll kill him where he lies." Catherine looked down at Thomas, who was struggling to reload his revolver with one functional arm. Blood soaked his shirt, and his face was pale with shock and pain, but his eyes remained alert and determined. "What kind of father sells his daughter? To pay gambling debts?" Catherine called back. "What kind of man destroys the one person who ever believed in his child's potential?" "The kind who's trying to keep his family alive," Marcus replied, but his voice carried more desperation than conviction. "Blackwood will kill us both if you don't surrender now. Then we die free instead of living as slaves." Catherine raised the derringer, its 2 remaining shots seeming pitifully inadequate against her father's rifle, but her hands didn't shake, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had finally learned her own worth. "I forgive you for the gambling, father. I forgive you for the debts, and even for considering Blackwood's bargain. But I'll never forgive you for not believing. I was worth more than the price he offered." Marcus Hartwell's rifle wavered as tears streamed down his weathered face. "Catherine, please." "Goodbye, father." The federal gunfire was growing closer, and Thomas could hear the sound of horses approaching at a gallop through the trees. Whatever confrontation was taking place elsewhere had apparently concluded in favor of the law, and reinforcements were riding hard toward the sound of gunfire from this direction. "Federal marshals," a commanding voice shouted from the forest above, "throw down your weapons and surrender." Marcus Hartwell looked frantically between his daughter and the approaching lawman, realizing that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. In desperation, he swung his rifle toward Thomas, apparently deciding that killing the schoolteacher might still accomplish Blackwood's objectives. Catherine didn't hesitate. The derringer spoke twice in rapid succession, both bullets finding their mark in her father's chest. Marcus Hartwell staggered backward, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the air, then toppled over the edge of the rocky outcropping that had provided his sniper's perch. The sudden silence that followed was broken only by the sound of approaching hoofbeats and Thomas's labored breathing as he struggled against the shock of his wound. Catherine knelt beside him, pressing her hands against the bleeding shoulder while tears streamed down her dirt-stained face. "I killed him," she whispered. "I killed my own father." "You saved both our lives," Thomas replied, his voice weak but steady. "And you protected the future he was trying to destroy." 6 federal marshals appeared at the rim of the gully, their weapons drawn but lowered as they surveyed the carnage. Their leader, a grizzled veteran with silver hair and steady eyes, dismounted and approached cautiously. "I'm Marshal William Hayes," he announced. "Are you Thomas Whitmore and Catherine Hartwell?" "How did you know our names?" Catherine asked, looking up from Thomas's wound. "Mrs. Eleanor Crawford sent word to Denver 3 days ago, requesting federal assistance for a kidnapping case involving forced prostitution. We've been tracking Silas Blackwood's operation for months, waiting for someone brave enough to testify against him." Thomas managed a weak smile. "Mrs. Crawford doesn't miss much. Neither do you, apparently. That fire you set at the trestle delayed Blackwood's main force long enough for us to position our men. We arrested him and 8 of his associates about 2 miles from here." Catherine looked stunned. "Blackwood is in custody, along with most of his organization. The few who escaped won't be operating in this territory again." Marshal Hayes knelt beside Thomas, examining his wound with experienced eyes. "This needs proper medical attention, but it's not immediately life-threatening. We have a doctor with our patrol." As the marshals worked to stabilize Thomas's condition and secure the area, Catherine sat quietly beside him, her hand resting gently on his uninjured arm. The ordeal that had begun 3 days earlier in a Millfield schoolhouse was finally over, but Thomas could see that the emotional cost weighed heavily on her shoulders. "I know what you're thinking," he said softly, "but you're not responsible for your father's choices. He made his decision when he agreed to Blackwood's bargain." "I keep thinking about who he used to be," Catherine replied. "Before the gambling, before the debts, he taught me to read when I was 5 years old. He used to say education was the one thing nobody could take away from a person. He was right about that. And in the end, your education, your ability to think strategically and act decisively, is what saved us both." Marshal Hayes returned with his medical officer, a competent-looking man who immediately began cleaning and bandaging Thomas's wound. "You'll need to stay off that arm for several weeks," the doctor advised, "but there's no permanent damage." "What happens now?" Catherine asked. "We escort you to Denver, where you'll be asked to provide testimony about Blackwood's operation," Marshal Hayes explained. "After that, you're free to go wherever you choose." Catherine looked at Thomas, her eyes bright with possibilities that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. "I still want to be a teacher. Denver has several excellent schools that would benefit from your talents," Thomas replied, "and I know people who could help you get established." "What about you? Will you continue teaching?" Thomas considered the question carefully. The past 3 days had shown him dimensions of education that extended far beyond classroom walls. Lessons about courage, sacrifice, and the price of standing up for what was right. "I think my teaching methods may have evolved somewhat," he said with a slight smile. "But yes, I'll continue. Someone has to make sure the next generation learns that some things are worth fighting for." As the Federal Patrol prepared to escort them to safety, Thomas reflected on the journey that had transformed them both from teacher and student into partners in a fight for freedom and dignity. Catherine had indeed become the remarkable woman he had glimpsed in that first classroom encounter, but the price of that transformation would mark them both forever. The sun was setting behind the mountains as they rode toward Denver, painting the sky in colors that reminded Thomas of hope, finally fulfilling its promise. Catherine rode beside him, no longer the frightened girl who had fled Millfield in darkness, but a young woman who had discovered her own strength and refused to let anyone else define her worth. Their real education was just beginning. The journey to Denver took 2 days, with the Federal Patrol maintaining a cautious pace to accommodate Thomas's injury and ensure they encountered no remaining members of Blackwood's scattered organization. Marshal Hayes proved to be an experienced commander who had spent years tracking criminal networks across the Colorado Territory, and his insights into Blackwood's operation revealed the true scope of what they had escaped. "Your case was the key we needed," Hayes explained as they camped the first night in a protected valley. Blackwood had been operating for years, but his victims were always too terrified to testify. Debt bondage, intimidation, systematic destruction of anyone who opposed him. It's a pattern we've seen before, but never with such sophisticated organization. Catherine listened intently as the marshal detailed Blackwood's methods. How many other girls were trapped in his establishments? 17 that we know of, across 3 different towns. Some as young as 15, others who had been held for years through various forms of coercion. Hayes poked at the campfire with a stick, his weathered face grim in the flickering light. Your escape gave them hope that resistance was possible. When we arrested Blackwood, 3 of them agreed to testify against him. Thomas, his arm in a sling but his mind sharp despite the pain medication, recognized the broader implications. So our flight wasn't just about Catherine's freedom, it was about breaking an entire system of exploitation. Exactly. Blackwood's power depended on the perception that he was untouchable, that resistance was futile. When a school teacher and his student managed to outmaneuver his entire organization, that perception crumbled. Catherine stared into the fire, processing the knowledge that their desperate escape had inadvertently sparked a larger liberation. What will happen to those other girls now? We're working with charitable organizations in Denver to provide shelter, education, and job training. Most of them have families they can return to once Blackwood's network is fully dismantled. Others will need to build new lives entirely. I'd like to help with that, Catherine said quietly, if there's a way. Marshal Hayes studied her with approval. I suspect there will be many opportunities for someone with your particular combination of intelligence and courage. That evening, as Thomas rested against his saddle and watched Catherine help the patrol's cook prepare dinner, he marveled at the transformation he had witnessed. The frightened girl he had first encountered in his classroom had evolved into a young woman who thought instinctively about helping others facing similar circumstances. Her education in survival had become an education in leadership. Dr. Morrison, the patrol's medical officer, changed Thomas's bandages by firelight while offering a professional assessment. The wound is healing cleanly, no signs of infection. You were fortunate the bullet passed through muscle tissue without hitting bone or major blood vessels. How long before I can resume normal activities? 6 weeks for full recovery, but you should be able to handle light duties within a fortnight. Teaching doesn't require the same physical demands as ranch work or mining. Thomas nodded, though privately he wondered if his concept of teaching would ever again be limited to classroom instruction. The past week had shown him that education extended far beyond academic subjects to include lessons about justice, courage, and the responsibility to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The next morning brought unexpected news that would reshape their understanding of recent events. A rider approached their camp, carrying dispatches from Denver, including a telegram that Marshal Hayes read with growing amazement. "This changes everything," he announced, gathering Thomas and Catherine around the dying campfire. "The telegram is from Judge Harrison in Denver. It seems Mrs. Eleanor Crawford didn't just contact federal marshals about your situation." "What else did she do?" Catherine asked. "She researched your father's debts and discovered that Blackwood had been systematically manipulating gambling games to create artificial obligations. Your father wasn't just unlucky at cards. He was deliberately cheated out of money he didn't have, then offered loans at impossible terms designed to ensure default." Thomas felt a surge of anger at the calculated cruelty of the scheme. So Catherine's father was as much a victim as a perpetrator. In many ways, yes. Mrs. Crawford's investigation turned up evidence that Blackwood had been operating rigged gambling operations specifically to acquire young women for his establishments. The debts were never meant to be repaid. They were tools of entrapment. Catherine absorbed this information with the careful analysis that characterized her approach to complex problems. "Does this change anything legally? My father still agreed to the arrangement, still participated in my intended sale. Legally, it provides context that might have reduced his culpability if he had survived to face trial. Personally," Hayes paused, choosing his words carefully, "it means he was trapped in an impossible situation, manipulated by professionals who understood exactly how to exploit desperate people." The revelation cast Marcus Hartwell's actions in a different light, without excusing them entirely. Thomas watched Catherine process this new understanding, seeing her wrestle with conflicting emotions about the father she'd been forced to kill in self-defense. "He still made the choice to hunt us," she said finally. "Whatever pressure Blackwood applied, my father chose to track his own daughter through the wilderness with a rifle." "Yes," Hayes agreed. "But perhaps that choice was made by a man who had already been broken by systematic manipulation and impossible circumstances." Understanding doesn't equal forgiveness, Catherine replied, but it helps explain how a man who once taught me to read could become someone willing to destroy my future. They reached Denver on a crisp afternoon when the first snow of winter dusted the distant peaks with crystalline white. The city sprawled across the high plains, like a promise of civilization and opportunity, its streets bustling with the energy of a community that had survived boom and bust cycles to emerge stronger and more determined. The federal courthouse, where they would provide testimony, stood at the heart of the city, its stone facade representing the rule of law that had ultimately protected them from Blackwood's predatory empire. But for Thomas, the more significant landmark was the cluster of school buildings visible from the courthouse steps, institutions where Catherine could finally pursue her dreams without fear or interference. Judge Harrison proved to be a man of perhaps 60 years, with the patient demeanor of someone who had spent decades distinguishing between justice and mere legal procedure. He interviewed them separately and together, building a comprehensive record of Blackwood's operation that would ensure convictions for the entire criminal network. "Your testimony has been invaluable," he told them after 2 days of detailed questioning. "Blackwood and his associates will face federal charges for kidnapping, forced prostitution, interstate transportation of victims, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The evidence you've provided ensures they'll spend the rest of their lives in federal prison." "What about the other victims?" Catherine asked. "The girls who were trapped in his establishments?" "Most are now in protective custody while we prepare their cases. Several have expressed interest in meeting you. They consider you something of a hero for proving that escape was possible." Catherine looked uncomfortable with the characterization. "I was just trying to save my own life. Thomas was the one who chose to risk everything to help me. Heroism often begins with individual acts of survival," Judge Harrison observed, "but it becomes something larger when those acts inspire others to resist oppression." That evening, Thomas and Catherine walked through Denver's streets as free citizens for the first time since their escape from Millfield. The city offered anonymity and opportunity in equal measure, a place where their past would not define their future possibilities. "The Teachers' Association has a position available," Thomas told her as they paused outside a small restaurant that offered the luxury of a hot meal at a proper table. "Assistant instructor at the Larimer Street School, with opportunities for advancement based on merit. And you? Have you decided what comes next?" Thomas considered the question that had occupied his thoughts during their testimony sessions. Judge Harrison mentioned that the federal government is establishing schools in territories where criminal organizations have been disrupted, places where teachers with unconventional experience might be particularly valuable. Catherine smiled at his diplomatic phrasing. "You mean places where teachers might need to be prepared for more than classroom management?" "Exactly. The frontier needs educators who understand that knowledge and courage are equally important in building civilized communities." They entered the restaurant and found a table near a window that looked out on the busy street. For the first time in weeks, they could enjoy a meal without watching for pursuers or calculating escape routes. The simple pleasure of safety felt almost foreign after their prolonged flight through the wilderness. "I keep thinking about those other girls," Catherine said as they waited for their food. "The ones who are just now learning they're free to make their own choices. You want to help them. I want to teach them, not just reading and arithmetic, but the kinds of lessons you taught me, that they have value beyond what others try to assign them, that their dreams matter enough to fight for." Thomas raised his coffee cup in a toast to the most important education of all, learning your own worth. Catherine clinked her cup against his. "And to the teacher who showed me that some lessons can only be learned outside any classroom." As they talked and planned their separate but connected futures, Thomas realized that their relationship had evolved into something unique and precious. They were no longer simply teacher and student, nor were they romantic partners in any conventional sense. Instead, they had become allies in the cause of education itself. Two people who understood that real learning required not just books and blackboards, but the courage to stand up for principles, even when the cost was everything they had previously known. Outside the restaurant window, Denver's evening lights began to twinkle like earthbound stars, each one representing dreams and possibilities that stretched toward an unlimited horizon. Catherine's future as an educator was assured, but more importantly, she had learned lessons about her own strength and value that no one could ever take away. Their journey from a failing mining town to Colorado's territorial capital had covered less than 100 miles geographically, but the distance they had traveled in terms of self-discovery and mutual respect couldn't be measured in any conventional terms. They had both been transformed by their shared ordeal into the people they were always meant to become. The real adventure was just beginning. 6 months after their arrival in Denver, Thomas stood at the window of his new office in the Federal Territorial Education Department, watching Catherine cross the street from the Larimer Street School where she had just finished her afternoon classes. The spring sunshine caught the confidence in her stride, the way she carried herself like someone who had finally discovered her place in the world. She had flourished as an assistant instructor, quickly earning the respect of both colleagues and students with her innovative teaching methods and intuitive understanding of children who came from difficult circumstances. Word of her success had spread throughout Denver's educational community, and Thomas wasn't surprised when she knocked on his door carrying a letter that would change everything. "The Colorado Springs School Board," she announced without preamble, settling into the chair across from his desk with the directness that had replaced her former timidity. "They're offering me a head instructor position at their new girls' academy." Thomas examined the official correspondence, noting the generous salary and comprehensive benefits package. "This is exactly the kind of opportunity you've been working toward. Congratulations." "I haven't accepted yet." Catherine's expression grew thoughtful. "The position comes with the authority to design the entire curriculum from scratch. They want someone who understands that educating young women requires more than just preparing them for domestic roles." "And you're hesitating because?" "Because I keep thinking about those girls we met at the shelter last month, the ones who escaped from situations similar to mine. They need education, but not the kind offered in traditional schools. They need to learn that they have value, that their dreams matter, that they can build lives based on their own choices rather than other people's expectations." Thomas leaned back in his chair, recognizing the analytical mind that had saved both their lives during their escape from Millfield. Catherine wasn't just considering a career opportunity. She was contemplating how to use her position to create systemic change. "You're thinking about establishing a different kind of institution," he said, "something that addresses the specific needs of young women who have been exploited or marginalized." "Exactly. The Colorado Springs Academy is a wonderful opportunity, but it's designed for girls from wealthy families who already have social advantages. What about the others, the ones society wants to forget?" Catherine produced a carefully written proposal from her satchel, placing it on his desk with the pride of someone presenting a completed mathematical proof. "I've been working on this for weeks. A residential academy specifically designed for young women who need to rebuild their lives after traumatic circumstances." Thomas read through her proposal with growing admiration. Catherine had outlined a comprehensive program that combined traditional academic subjects with practical life skills, psychological support, and what she termed empowerment education. Those are courses designed to help students recognize and develop their own potential. The funding alone would be enormous, he observed. Facilities, staff, ongoing operational costs. Judge Harrison introduced me to several wealthy Denver families who have expressed interest in supporting progressive educational initiatives. The Talbots lost a daughter to circumstances similar to what I faced, and they're willing to provide substantial backing for the right program. Catherine's eyes sparkled with excitement. Thomas, we learned things during our escape that can't be taught from textbooks, about courage, about self-worth, about the importance of refusing to accept other people's definitions of your value. Those lessons need to be part of any real education. You'd want me to help design the program? I'd want you to run it with me. Co-directors, equal partners in creating something that's never been attempted before. That evening, Thomas walked through Denver's streets contemplating Catherine's proposal. The city had grown familiar over the past months, but her vision had reawakened something restless in his spirit, the same drive that had led him to risk everything for a student's freedom. 3 weeks later, construction began on the Catherine, Hartwell Academy for young women in the foothills outside Denver. The name had been Catherine's insistence, though she preferred to call it simply Haven in daily conversation. The location provided both privacy and accessibility, close enough to the city for resources, but far enough away to offer a sanctuary atmosphere. The opening ceremony took place on a golden September morning, with 15 young women between the ages of 16 and 22 as the Academy's first students. Each had survived circumstances that would have broken weaker spirits: trafficking, debt bondage, family abandonment, or various forms of exploitation that thrived in the shadows of frontier society. Thomas addressed the assembled students, their families and supporters, from the steps of the main academic building. Education has always been about transformation, he began, but here at Haven, we understand that transformation requires more than books and lectures. It requires the courage to reimagine what your life can become. Catherine followed with remarks that drew on her own journey from victim to educator. 6 months ago, I stood where many of you stand today, uncertain about my worth, unsure whether my dreams mattered enough to fight for. This academy exists to answer those questions definitively. Your dreams do matter. Your potential is limitless, and your past does not define your future. The applause that followed carried an emotional weight that transcended mere ceremony. These young women had found not just an educational opportunity, but proof that survival could become transformation, that trauma could become strength. The first year challenged every assumption about traditional education. Students studied literature alongside self-defense, mathematics alongside financial independence, science alongside legal rights. Catherine's innovation was to integrate practical survival skills with academic achievement, creating graduates who were both intellectually accomplished and personally empowered. Thomas found himself teaching courses he had never imagined. Strategic, thinking under pressure, recognizing and resisting manipulation, building support networks in hostile environments. The curriculum emerged from their shared experience of desperate flight and eventual triumph. Lessons learned in mountain caves and railroad tunnels translated into systematic instruction. By spring, the Academy's reputation had spread throughout the territory. Requests for admission arrived from across Colorado and neighboring states, while educational reformers made pilgrimages to observe their innovative methods. More importantly, the first graduates were finding success in careers ranging from teaching to business to law, fields previously closed to women of their backgrounds. One evening in late May, Thomas and Catherine sat on the Academy's front porch, reviewing applications for the following year's expanded enrollment. The mountain sunset painted the sky in colors that reminded them both of their first evening as fugitives, when survival seemed impossible and the future remained unimaginable. "Do you ever think about that night we left Millfield?" Catherine asked, setting aside a particularly compelling application from a young woman in Wyoming. "Every day," Thomas admitted, "not with regret, but with amazement at how far we've traveled." "Not just geographically." "No, not just geographically." Thomas smiled at the young woman who had become his partner in the most important work of his life. "You've exceeded every hope I had for your potential. We've exceeded them. This academy, these students, the lives we're changing. None of it would exist without both of us." A student approached from the dormitory building. Maria Santos, whose family had been destroyed by a criminal organization similar to Blackwood's. She had arrived at the academy barely literate and traumatized, but was now preparing to enter Teachers' College in the fall. "Miss Catherine, Mr. Thomas," she said formally, still slightly intimidated by addressing her instructors directly, "I wanted to thank you for the recommendation letter. The college in Boulder accepted me with a full scholarship." Catherine stood and embraced the young woman warmly. "You earned that scholarship through your own hard work and determination. We just provided the opportunity." "You provided more than opportunity," Maria replied. "You provided proof that someone like me could have dreams worth pursuing." After Maria returned to the dormitory, Thomas and Catherine resumed their quiet contemplation of the future they were building together. The academy had become more than an educational institution. It was a demonstration that society's most vulnerable members could become its strongest advocates for justice and positive change. I received another letter from Colorado Springs. "Today," Catherine mentioned casually, "they're still hoping I'll reconsider their offer. And I told them I already have the position I want. This academy, these students, this mission, it's exactly what I was meant to do with my life." Thomas nodded with satisfaction. "I feel the same way. We've found our calling." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they reflected on the journey that had brought them from a failing mining town to this haven of hope and transformation. Catherine's dreams of becoming a teacher had been fulfilled beyond her wildest imagination, while Thomas had discovered that true education extended far beyond any classroom he had ever known. The Catherine Hartwell Academy stood as a testament to the power of refusing to accept limitations imposed by others, of fighting for the right to dream and achieve regardless of circumstances. Most importantly, it proved that the most valuable education often came from the courage to stand up for what was right, even when the cost seemed impossibly high. Their real adventure had indeed just begun, but it was no longer a desperate flight toward an uncertain future. Instead, it had become a purposeful journey toward a destiny they were creating together. One student, one dream, one transformed life at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.